This is a tutorial about making binding. Hopefully you'll have seen my earlier tutorial which talks about the equipment that you'll need to finish off your quilt. You may have seen in there, but I'll explain again. So binding is a kind of a fabric piece that goes around the edge of your quilt after you've wadded it, after you've made the sandwich with the wadding and you've made it with the backing. And you then need the binding to go around the edge to kind of close it off so that you don't have any raw edges, and raw edges are the end of the fabric that haven't been sewn. The important thing to say at this point is you can buy binding tape. So this is a cotton binding tape, and I showed it on the early tutorial about the equipment that you'll need for the little tutorial quilt that I'm doing. And for the tutorial quilt, I'm going to use a bought binding. You can buy it in lots of different sizes. This one is an inch wide, which will be perfect for our purposes. So if you don't want to make binding and you don't want to have to use an iron, because ironing is pretty much most of making binding. If you think that that's too complicated, you can buy binding, and you can buy it usually by the meter, either online or from a sort of haberdasher's. In this period of time where we can't go to the haberdashers in person, there's lots online that you can go to, and you can also go to, sometimes you can contact fabric companies who are now doing delivery online that wouldn't normally. So that's bought bias binding, and that's the bias binding that I'll be using on the tutorial quilt. But for anybody who does have some fabric left and wants to make binding, I'm going to show you how to. This fabric that I have here is actually a binding that I'm making for another quilt that I'm working on. So I won't be using this on the tutorial quilt, but it's just a way of showing you quite bright colours, as you can see. I have tried as much as possible in these tutorials to show you how to do things without needing all of the kind of fancy measuring equipment. So I have cut my binding to 2.5 inches, and I've done that with a rotary cutter and with a proper ruler, etc. However, there is a way of making a template for yourself, which involves using an A4 piece of paper. So hopefully you'll have seen on the early tutorial that I mentioned that A4 pieces of paper are brilliant for any kind of measuring because they're standard sizes. So across the shorter edge, they tend to be 21 centimetres, and across the longer edge, they tend to be 30 centimetres or roughly. So if you're doing rough measuring, A4 paper is really helpful. So to make a template for your binding, all you do is you take your piece of A4 paper. This is an old piece of paper about Roman blinds. And using that piece of paper, you can fold it in half. I've done this before already just to show you. So you can fold that piece of paper in half. Then you can fold that piece of paper again, so into a quarter strip. And then that width there of that piece that you've got, the last quarter piece, that'll be perfect for the width of your binding strip. So you can cut that out, then you can use that as a template to draw along. You'll need that template again when you make the 45-degree angles, and I'll show you how to do that. So keep the template after you've cut all the binding that you need. On the other tutorial, I talk about how you work out how much binding you need. That's on the section where you actually attach the binding to the quilt. So once you've cut your strips of fabric, you'll need, I imagine that you won't have one piece that will go around your whole quilt, so you may need to attach more than one piece together. If that's the case, I'm going to show you the way that I would normally do it. So if I was making a quilt top myself, which includes making a 45-degree angle. If you do it straight across, so you make your cut here and you make it straight rather than on a 45-degree angle, it's fine. All it does is it means that that sort of slightly bulky bit of seam that you'll make will all be in one place on the binding. But if that's the easiest way to do it and you're happy to do it, then you can do it straight across. I'm going to do it 45 degrees and I'm going to show you how to do that here on my mat. So if I imagine that I've cut out my template, so this strip section, and you've made your template and you've cut your binding as we mentioned before, so you've made this template and drawn along to make sure that it's straight. Then you take your strip, and where you have your fabric, if you imagine that this is square, so before I've chopped that 45-degree angle, the way to work out where the 45 degrees would be is to put your paper along the side. This one's a bit thinner than the binding that I've cut, so it won't look quite right. But you then mark where the two corners of the fabric and the paper meet. Make a mark there, and if you draw directly from there to the corner of your fabric, that'll make you a 45-degree angle, which you can then cut along. So on this piece, I've cut my 45-degree angle. I've also then put on my seam allowance. That is a line that could be the same as the width that you used for your templates earlier. So this could be a very particular measurement, or it could be a width of a chopstick or a pencil or whatever it is that you're using for your template. And I always suggest that you just try and use objects around your house for standard sizes, because you can use those as templates. So you'll have drawn your line across, and that'll give you your line for stitching. The next part of making binding is very similar to sewing the squares together. So you take your second piece of binding and you take your first piece of binding. This is the only bit of this that's a little bit complicated, and it takes a little bit of getting your head round. So you want your two 45-degree angles to join up. So your edges will line up together, and then where you want them to meet is where the line is at the edge of your fabric. Hopefully you can see that, and you want that to line up with your second fabric. And if you do that, then you know that when you pull it apart, it'll be straight. So again, exactly like pinning two squares together, I just pin the end first, and then I make sure that I pin the other end. So I line up my two fabrics, and then you can see, because my line was straight and my drawn line was straight, it means that that line now joins to the orange fabric. And I put in another pin, and then I stick a pin in the middle. And then I take my thread, my ugly brown thread from earlier, and using exactly the same stitch as I did with the two squares, I just put a running stitch across there. So I take my thread through, I go back and do my second stitch to keep it secure. And you want this to be really tight, because when you iron it, you're going to split the seam open, which I'll show you. And then you're going to stitch your running stitch all the way along, pulling your pins out as you go. So you'll see here, again, I've got my wrong side of my fabric and my wrong side of my fabric, and you can see hopefully the running stitch that goes all the way along there, along my line. And you can see there's a little triangle overhang of the other fabric. That's really important. And then you pull that open, and when you pull it open, you'll see that it makes one continuous length. If I hadn't lined up my seam line in the way that I did, this wouldn't be straight on either edge. You would end up with one slightly over at either side, and that's why it's important to line up your seams, line up your seam line and not the edge of the fabric with each other. And that can, like I said, be a bit complicated, and it might take a few attempts. So I'm going to move to the ironing board, and I'm going to show you how to iron the seam out.